Thanks, Amanda, for that really generous introduction. Yeah, actually, I started one of the earliest burns I did when I started my fire career here on Long Island, helping TNC burn at Montauk. And the thing I remember the most about that is these things called ticks. I grew up in the southern Adirondacks. I had no clue what a tick was. So I got educated in a bunch of ways here on Long Island. But one of the first fires I did in '94 was down here. But I want to take a few minutes. It's kind of a case study, just kind of what we're doing in Albany. And I hope that some of what we're doing there may translate to some of the work that you all want to do here. And like I said, I'm trained as a fire ecologist and a field ornithologist, but I've been working with prescribed fire for over 20 years, up to the burn boss level on about 80 fires. So as you know, the pitch pine scrub oak barrens are scattered in this archipelago of unique habitat islands across the Northeast. And you've got basically coastal and inland pitch pine scrub oak barrens. Albany Pine Bush is one of the better inland pitch pine scrub oak barrens. But of course, you've got New Jersey, Long Island, and Cape Cod as three of the really big, beautiful coastal pitch pine scrub oak barrens or pine barrens. And what all of these have in common is they're all pyrophilic. They're all fire dependent. And that means not only is fire inevitable, but fire is also essential. I like to tell students when I'm leading tours and talking to classes that fire in these ecosystems is as essential and as rain and sunshine to making these systems work effectively and efficiently. And they all host a really large, diverse group of rare biodiversity, which is one of the reasons why there's a lot of conservation focus on them. But of course, they're also, as you know about the Northeast, it's pretty populated, and I'll show that slide in a second. So the Albany Pine Bush was originally about 25,000 acres in size. It's now less than 5,000 acres in size. The preserve is 3,300. And it's unique among all of the other pine barrens in that ours is not flat and the sand is incredibly fine because it's a glacial sand plain that was driven by the prevailing winds into sand dunes. It's the largest inland field of sand dunes east of the Rockies, and it's one of the reasons why we received the National Natural Landmark designation in 2014. And because of that dune structure, it's incredibly diverse. You've got, unlike most of the rest which are flat, ours with the rolling hills, you've got high and dry, low and cool and wet, north-facing, south-facing slopes, creates an amazing niche diversity. And for us, the highest quality pitch pine scrub oak barrens has this kind of a gestalt to it. It's an open canopied savanna within a savanna, an open canopy of predominantly pitch pine with some oak. Then the understory is an open canopy of a couple different species of scrub oak, a wide variety of other dwarf shrubs, several different, dwarf prairie willows and dwarf cherries, huckleberry, blueberry, and then this really interesting mix of prairie grasses and wildflowers. It's state and globally rare, and Albany is the type locality, or the first place the endangered cardinal blue butterfly was discovered by Vladimir Nabokov. And there, of course, is the cardinal blue butterfly. I can't give this talk without mentioning the butterfly. But talk about wildland and urban interface. The Albany Pine Bush Preserve is currently 3,300 acres in size. And it covers, it's sandwiched between the city of Albany and the city of Schenectady. This we like to call Mount Trashmore. That's the Albany landfill. You can see Interstate 90 and 87. Crossgates Mall is here. SUNY Albany is right here, and SUNY Nanotech. And the city of Schenectady is to the west. It spans 3 different municipalities. So our board of directors, if you will, or our commission, is chaired by DEC, the commissioner of DEC, co-chaired by the commissioner of state parks, or OPRHP. You're all New Yorkers, you know what that is, I don't have to spell that out. But then it's also, by law, it's the mayor of the city of Albany, the town supervisors for the 2 local towns, the county executive, the New York State director of the Nature Conservancy, and 4 private citizens appointed by the governor and approved by the Senate. So that's basically who I work for. Well, I work for the executive director. He works for those guys. But everything we do here in politics and people will come up later in this presentation, but politics and people is as important to everything we do in Albany as is the biology and the fire ecology of this place. But to date, we've protected 3,300 acres toward a goal of 3,300 acres. The other thing I hope you notice, and not only do we have wildland urban interface, but we don't have the luxury of having one contiguous block of open space to protect and manage. We have this postage stamp relic of what used to be, and then that postage stamp was dissected into a jigsaw puzzle for us. So managing ecosystem viability and function within that kind of a landscape is a really interesting ecological challenge. I mentioned pine barrens are important for biodiversity. The Albany Pine Bush, no exception. Supports 75 wildlife species of greatest conservation need, according to the state's plan. That is 20% of all of the wildlife species of greatest conservation need listed for the state of New York. So incredibly rich biodiversity, principally across these 3 taxonomic groups: reptiles and amphibians, shrubland birds, and insects. Like here, wildland-urban interface is incredibly important to us. I want to thank the Nature Conservancy for this slide. But the red is basically the urban areas, and Albany, as you can see, much like Long Island, the Central Pine Barrens, is sandwiched in all this gray. So you've got wildland-urban interface and then development. And again, those pine barrens exist in this kind of a landscape. It's an archipelago of habitat islands in an urbanizing sea of forest, of urban, people and forests. And the urban interface for us is really interesting. This maybe will give you a little bit more of a sense of scale from the previous map. But again, here's our office, the Discovery Center, a former bank that we recycled. Here's a growing season burn. I believe this is June of 2006. And this is County Route 155, and this is around 3 o'clock, so that's always a busy road. Here's the New York State Thruway, Mount Trashmore. We've got shopping malls, 3 high-rise nursing homes with external air intake, the Thruway, and all kinds of commercial and residential and industrial development around us. Give you a better sense of that, you got to love Google Earth. They happened to be flying over in July a couple of years ago when we were doing a prescribed fire in Pine Barrens West. Again, here's the Discovery Center, the landfill, and the Thruway. And this was, we did about 30 acres that day. And that's, there's our smoke column from that day. So wildland-urban interface is incredibly important to us, as are the people that live and work in this landscape. And I'll come up to that again. So the commission initiated prescribed fire in 1991, largely with the thanks of the Nature Conservancy and the New York State DEC, the forest rangers in particular. The law that created the preserve and the commission basically said it's for pitch pine scrub oak barrens, and it has to be managed with fire. It's right there in the law. At that time, it was still illegal to be putting fire in the woods. Agricultural burns were allowed, but woodland fires were not. So the prescribed burn law was created as an outflow of the law that created the preserve. And as Dr. Patterson said, we started very, very small, burning small demonstration burns, half an acre, surrounded by local fire. We have 9 local fire departments, surrounded by firemen in turnout gear with large full-size structural engines surrounding these small little fires. People were nervous. And ideally the fires were really for ecological, looking at ecosystem viability and rare wildlife conservation, fuels management, and also those early fires were all about training. And what we learned from dormant season fire, none of you will be shocked about, and that's a dormant season fire right there, is that we conducted dormant season fire because the fire record suggested most of the fires happened in the dormant season. But these are really challenging fires. This is a prescribed fire. This is one of our near misses. So we call this the devil burn for kind of obvious reasons if you squint. But it looks kind of evil, like there's a fire Godzilla in the middle of that fire. And this was not the unit we wanted to burn. That was. And light and variable winds in dormant season pine barrens is not a good idea. So we pinched it off in the next unit, and everything was good with this, but we learned a lot. Dormant season pitch pine scrub oak barrens, very high rates of spread, high flame lengths, light and variable winds. It's kind of like a grass fire in that a shifty wind can really move the fire far and fast. Additionally, we decided we needed to get away from dormant season fire in barrens. And I'll talk about that in a second. But also, we weren't meeting our ecological objectives even with these fires. I liken it, after decades of fire suppression, these dormant season fires, we wanted to expose mineral soil, and I liken it to peeling an onion. Where a dormant season fire, you're constantly every fire, you're just scraping the surface because the rates of spread are so fast, it doesn't burn down through that stuff. So every couple of years when you go back and burn, you peel off another couple layers of the onion. And it was taking a long time to expose mineral soil and meet some of our objectives. And as I said, we had a near miss, this one, and one small escape in '99. And this is somewhat serendipitous. So we started working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Partners Program. We realized we wanted to mechanically pre-treat those scrub oak fuels. You can burn under scrub oak, huckleberry, blueberry scrub oak the first time relatively easily. That previous fire, the near miss, the escape were in reburns, areas we had burned before, waited too long to go back, So now we had standing dead scrub oak that was 10 to 15 feet tall with a beautiful flammable bed of huckleberry, blueberry, and pine needles underneath it, and it's really volatile. So we decided to rearrange and mechanically treat those fuels, thinking that we would wait a year and go back in there the following dormant season, but we realized that the mowing slash from the hydroax was ripe and ready to go a month later. So we actually ended up waiting until it greened up and put our fire ecology hats on, hoping that the live fuel moisture content in that vegetation, it takes so much energy to evaporate all that water, would slow the fire down, and it did. And what we ended up with were these really intense, slow-moving fires. Smoke, what we were worried about smoke being an issue, but smoke wasn't an issue because we generated so much heat that it pushed that smoke up and away. We were also able to burn on the wet end of the prescription. So in Pine Barrens, I never like burning on the dry end of the prescription, not unless the fuel loading is really, really light. But this allowed us to burn in the growing season with light and variable winds. You could almost outwalk these fires. And under the wet end of the prescription, as soon as you ran out of the mowing slash, moisture of extinction put the fire out. So we ended up flank firing and in a couple of cases head firing into unmowed fuels in the growing season at the wet end of the prescription. And as soon as it ran out of that mowing slash, it went out. So we end up with, this doesn't look all that intense but these were really intense fires. We actually had a professor from RIT come out and he couldn't tell us how hot it was because we melted his thermocouples. He wasn't expecting that. And meeting ecological objectives like we had never done before. And so it ended up opening up the wet end of the prescription and allowing us to use light and variable winds in the growing season that I would never dream of doing in the dormant season in these fuels. And we've been doing that since 2003. But again, as Dr. Patterson suggested, we started off small. So we treated an 8-acre unit, mowed the whole thing, burned half a month later when it greened up. And the differences were pretty striking visually. If you only mow scrub oak, you get more scrub oak. And this is not a condition that's going to support lupin or any of the other wildflowers and grasses that so many of our rare species needed. It's also not a structure that many of the reptiles and amphibians or the birds like either. They'll live in it, but it's not great. As far as reptiles and amphibians and the insects are all cold-blooded. So this kind of a structure on the right is much more conducive because they're constantly needing to thermoregulate so they can get in the shade or out of the shade however they need. This is the same unit. We simply cut it in half. 4 acres mowed, 4 acres mowed and burned. And even at the plot level, you could see it. And we were pretty happy with this, and we retarded the scrub oak for about 3 growing seasons. And what we saw is that from a structural component and what we were looking to do, the circles here are mow only. The triangles are mow and burn. Structurally, the two were different. And that's really all you need to take away from this slide. Structurally, the two were different. And the biggest differences were more grasses and forbs, no leaf litter, and lots of exposed mineral soil. I mean, consuming that one treatment consumed 4 or 5 inches of litter and duff, exposing plenty of mineral soil that we needed to get lupin growing, which is the only wildflower the cardinal blue butterfly will eat. But, whoa, what was that button? Am I really out of time? Tim, do I need your help? Where is it? I'm pushing. The species composition of those 2 plots, there we go. You can see here the triangles and circles are intermixed because the species mix was still the same. So when we looked at those plots, we didn't lose any species, we didn't gain any species, but the structure was completely different, and it's those structural differences that we really wanted to get at. And some of them you can see here. We end up with a nice, we actually end up with a nice mosaic of burns, of some patches that don't burn very well at all and others that burn very intensely. That's about 4 inches, how long is a pitch pine needle? 3 or 4 inches of litter and duff. You can see the ring here that was left from the litter and duff before the burn, consumed in a single treatment. We actually had to modify this treatment and we don't mow right up to pitch pine because the only time pitch pine are really vulnerable is in the growing season. And if you produce all of that fuel and heat at the root collar, you can kill them. And we killed, 75, 80% of the 20 trees that were in that 8 acres. So subsequently, when we mow around pitch pine, we leave basically the drip line of the trees. And it's enough, it'll still burn, but it's enough to reduce the heat so that you don't hit the tree with that much heat in the growing season. And I love this. So we're looking to plant wild blue lupin. And planting lupin in the leaf litter, planting lupin in a scrub oak thicket isn't going to work, which isn't going to get us to our goals for recovering the Carner. And this is all exposed mineral soil. And 75, 80% of these units look like that with wide open sand. And as you can see, there's really no way to kill scrub oak unless you use herbicide, which is actually what we ended up going to do. We've done that. So here's our fire history since 1991. And we started off small with small research burns, 10, 9, 8 acres. And more recently in 2012 was 143, 13 was 212 acres, 217 acres in 2015. Last year wasn't very good. It was we only did 50, but already this season we did 40 and they're burning another 18 today. And the colors just correlate to the timing. So we're ending, I like the fact that this is a bit of a rainbow because it's a nice mosaic, not only a mosaic of burns and timing, but a mosaic of burn effects. I don't want all of these units to look exactly alike. Ideally, it will be, some units will burn hot, some will burn cool. All of that niche diversity that we have supporting all that rare biodiversity depends on that mosaic on the landscape. But to break it down a little bit, and some of these units were burned twice or multiple times. But if you think about it from a growing season versus a dormant season perspective, the green is growing season and the brown is dormant season fire. The other thing I like a lot about these growing season burns, particularly the mow and burn treatments, in the past, because we could only burn under a really narrow prescription, we were constantly hopscotching around all of these management units, some of which are 5 acres, some of which are closer to 50 acres in size, depending on the winds and the weather and where we could burn. And you could not reliably get, if our minimum, we have an ideal block burn size for a season, I'd like to get about 80 acres contiguously black over the course of a season. 50 to 85 is ideal for us at this landscape. Dormant season fire, that's incredibly hard because all you can do is follow the weather around. By burning it with being able to use light and variable winds at the wet end of the prescription, in the growing season, we were finally able to get 50, 60, 70 acre, 80 acre blocks over the course of the season burned contiguously, and that has tremendous ecological value to the plants and animals we're looking to conserve. So we talked about prescribed fire. All of these treatments are really about restoring altered fire regimes, mowing, but also the scrub oak, the mow and burn sites look great for about 3 growing seasons, and that's how long it takes for scrub oak to replenish its root reserves and then again become a thicket. So we needed more time than that, particularly for managing carners and all the other rare insects. We needed more permanent interstitial space between all that scrub oak. So we started herbiciding it. So we would go through and mow it again, and then when the sprouts were small, about half a meter tall, you can easily go through, you've all seen scrub oak sprout, and treat individual clumps. So we contract that work out to more permanently create that interstitial space. We want a fire return interval of 5 to 10 years. In the carner habitat, it's more likely 5 years to keep rejuvenating the carner habitat. But also, increasingly, we're doing a lot of silviculture. As Dr. Patterson showed you with one of his slides, we have a lot of hardwood forests, a lot of white pine, hardwood mixed forests that used to be barrens that we need to restore, and fire alone isn't going to do that. So we are using silviculture, not only in those cases, but also to remove too many hundreds of acres of non-native invasive black locust monocultures. And then we follow up, whether it's those mow and burn sites where we go in and interseed just lupin seed, which we collect locally, and plant it with our Truax seed drill right into the black a couple of days after the fire. Any time of year, we will plant lupin, and lupin, if you plant lupin in the black, lupin loves it. And the good thing is, experiments we've done, we know that female carners that feed on lupin that sprouted up out of the black produce more eggs and bigger offspring. That's actually helping facilitate the recovery of that animal. But we are using a lot more silviculture. These are 2 different stands where this was a pitch pine, white pine, and oak stand, and that's thinned down to about 25 to 30 trees per acre and around 30 square feet of basal area per acre is the residual stand we want. And same thing here. This was a closed canopy stand of pitch pine. And to date, we have the pink is black locust that we've removed, and we removed black locust. There's a local biology professor that says we like to take it back to the Pleistocene because there's no natives left underneath black locust. Cut them down, rip out the stumps, root rake the site, and plant a nice mix of native grasses and wildflowers and try and turn that into carner habitat. And the green is all of the forest thinning that we've done. And just this, most of the green is this winter, so that's close to 600 acres over the course of the last 2 winters of forest thinning projects. So now we'll follow that up with a little bit of herbicide work for bittersweet and other invasives, but really now we'll be able to get in there and use fire. And for us, here's the northway, and the northway right here is elevated, so smoke and prevailing westerly winds, smoke management is a huge issue for us. We could never get in here and burn, or almost never, because the canopy was too thick. To get eye-level winds at 7 miles an hour, which is what we wanted on average, you had to have a wind speed above those trees over 20 miles per hour, which is all it's going to do is shear off your smoke column and dump it in downtown Albany, or onto the thruway, or the northway where it's elevated. So by thinning this stand, not only are we meeting ecological objectives, but we're also facilitating our ability to use fire in those areas. But also, like here, we are concerned about wildfire risk and crown fire risk, and following work of Dr. Patterson and his grad student, Matt Devanek, I think I pronounced his name correctly. We looked at canopy bulk density and wildfire risk in some of our densest pitch pine stands. And lo and behold, realized that, these are, here's the thruway again. These are high-rise, 3-story, 4-story condos, duplexes, and an office park. And again, west is west, so prevailing winds. We knew we had an issue in here with crown fire risk. So knowing that, we then had an obligation to do something about it. So we went in also over the last 2 years and thinned all of the 85 acres of pitch pine. And that work we published as well, looking at modeling crown fire risk in those stands. And as it turns out, again, I love the serendipity of the pine bush. I've been there long enough where things just seem to keep coming together, and the more we do for ecological benefit, it turns out we're also benefiting fuels reduction, we're benefiting reducing wildfire risk, but also, as it turns out, thinning pitch pine and then managing those stands with fire is also likely going to make us more resilient to the southern pine beetle that will likely get there. We've had traps out working with DEC for the last couple of years. We haven't had any detections yet, but I think it's only a matter of time. But the residual trees, because they've been released from competition a little bit, are much healthier and much more able to defend themselves against southern pine beetle. But also by thinning the stands and providing for that airflow, you're disrupting the collection pheromones that the females and males release. So that opening those stands up not only reduces fire risk, improves our ecological goals, but also is making these stands more resilient to the likely invasion of southern pine beetle, which for all intents and purposes in reality is doing exactly what we would expect native species to do in the face of climate change. Move and find available food. I wish Karner blues could do the same thing, as well as southern pine beetle seems to be able to adapt. And are we advancing ecosystem viability? I think so. For us, this is the ideal gestalt. This is, now we'd burn this on every 5 to 10 years. It's an open savanna of pitch pine, an open savanna of scrub oak that you can see spotted around here. This is 2 years post-treatment. And then all this interstitial space is huckleberry, blueberry, grasses, sedges, and a heck of a lot of lupin. But it's not just about it's not just about what it looks like. It has to function for the wildlife. And no place do we have a good reference community where we can look at and say, that's a pine barrens that supports high populations of carners and prairie warblers and hognose snakes and smooth green snakes. But we have all of that, and we don't have that historical data. We don't have historical vegetative data for the Albany Pine Bush, but we have historical wildlife data. And we knew that many of these species of greatest conservation need were really abundant simultaneously. Carners and hognose snakes and spadefoot toads and Karner blues and eastern inland barrens buckmoth. So ultimately, we let the wildlife tell us if we're managing appropriately or not. Because if we're managing appropriately and advancing ecosystem health and viability, the distribution and abundance of these animals should go up. I'd show you a slide of lupin before we started planting, but it wouldn't show up at this scale. There were 9 sites that totaled 13 acres across the whole preserve. All of this blue is stuff that we've planted, lupin and other grasses and wildflowers that we've planted in our restoration sites. And our population of butterflies was so small that we needed to help them. We realized an adult butterfly lives 3 to 5 days and doesn't go more than 200 yards from where it hatched. So in order for us to deal with getting butterflies around this landscape, we had to facilitate that. So we had this program of accelerated colonization working with our friends up in New Hampshire Department of Fish and Game. Carners have 2 broods, so we'd catch June females, 20 of them, take them to New Hampshire. They'd rear out all the eggs those females produced. I got back pupa that went into our Discovery Center in the animal care room, and as they emerged as adults, they were taken out and released at individual sites. And not 10 or 20, but we were releasing 500 to 1,000 at any given site. We only released each site once. Then they're on their own. I wanted to know if it worked. And there's my field ecologist, Amanda Dillon, in a site that was thinned and planted, releasing carners. And it is working. So prior to 2007, we don't have population estimates because we weren't actually trying to do that. We just wanted to know where they were. But we've gone since 2007 from a few hundred animals to almost 20,000 in 2015. We're no longer releasing butterflies in the preserve. They are colonizing all the new habitat we create on their own, actually faster than I want them to. From permit perspective, there's things we want to do as follow-up treatments in some of these sites. But again, the federal recovery threshold is 3,000 butterflies, so we are well above that. So for all intents and purposes, we've met the recovery goals for common blue butterfly in the Albany Pine Bush. So it's working for them, but that's only one species. So we do a lot of monitoring. And thankfully, there's no shortage of graduate students in universities in upstate New York. So particularly SUNY ESF helped us look at inland barrens. Buck moth, turns out thinning scrub oak is a good thing for buck moth, and buck moth as caterpillars don't eat anything else. Turns out they pupate in the soil in that interstitial space we created between the scrub oak. So the microclimate between patches of scrub oak is where the buck moths pupate. We used to see tons of caterpillars on the trails, thinking, oh, they must be everywhere. No, they were coming to the trail because that was the only open spot they had. Bees and wasps, ants, other insects, a number of, particularly the rare Leps moths in particular, are doing really well. And several rediscoveries of this waxella moth. Last year, Shopman found another rare moth that was thought to have been extirpated from all of New York State and New England, and that was in a site we've been managing heavily. Henry's elfin was rediscovered in the preserve. That was thought to have also been extirpated from New York State. And this is all in managed sites. Same story for reptiles and amphibians. And my specialty, birds. So we do a lot of this, what are effectively second order fire effects, not so much directly measuring impacts of fire here, but looking at the landscape scale of how it's influencing the vegetative community and how it's influencing the animal community. These are just point counts to get bird abundance and distribution. And we're seeing all of these rare shrubland birds expanding into habitat that we've managed. And to give you a sense of scale, these are some really big numbers for these species. The New York State, Audubon Society would consider you as an important bird area candidate if you had 17 pair of prairie warblers, and we have 160 pair of prairie warblers in the preserve and growing. Thrashers, eastern towhee, they're doing really, really well in our managed sites. So we're managing the site, we think, effectively. We're improving our ecosystem viability, helping the rare biodiversity, but ultimately it's really about, we also have to connect with the people. We couldn't do any of this without connecting with the communities we're working within. And so we worked with an independent contractor out of Colorado, Conservation Impact, to better connect with the community at large. And we see this as engagement. We're no longer taking that, the old paradigm of environmental education where we do this, right? I stand up here, an environmental educator stands here and walks you through something and talks to you, but there's not a whole lot of interaction. Constituency engagement is all about creating opportunities for relationships and experiences in the preserve, in the place. So, and we have, instead of trying to target everybody, which we've done in the past, now we're really focusing on target audiences that we think would help us if our funding or our program was ever jeopardized. So for us, that was just a huge paradigm shift for us. We used to take the shotgun approach, throw spaghetti on the wall, see what sticks. So now basically we're going broad for our neutral awares. These are folks that drive through the preserve. They may know the preserve is there, but know nothing about it. Go deep for knowledgeable interested. So you can think of them as your curious folks that listen to NPR and watch PBS, the Scientific Minds, probably many of us in this room. Go long is about reaching middle schoolers and focusing on the New York State curriculum and giving them opportunities to work with STEM curriculum in the preserve. And then for the influencers, being integral. And again, our tagline is globally rare, nationally significant, and locally distinct. And that's on number 3 there, holding a brown thrasher. And we're creating all these opportunities from volunteer and citizen science opportunities, programs and festivals, media visibility, and improving our visibility. This is the local NBC affiliate in Albany at the roadside during one of our prescribed fires, and then they came by and talked to our fire manager, Tyler Briggs, and Burn Boss. And lastly, you've seen something like this on Long Island, because there was a model in Albany that was used down here for some of these signs, just making it visible so that when people see black on the roadside, what is that? Was that a wildfire? Is something wrong? No, we're just keeping the pine bush and burning for a better pine bush. And similarly, when it comes to tree thinning work, We put up these other billboards, and even when we're just doing mowing work and other maintenance, wherever we have anything that we're doing along the roadside that's visible, here's the flip side of that sign, so people know, oh, they're taking out another locust, it's a commission taking out another locust clone. That's not another Walmart or another strip mall going in, another office park. So in conclusion, we've been successfully managing and using fire for 24 years, but fire is only a part of the equation. There's a number of other techniques that we need to use to be able to burn safely and manage fuels, keep ourselves safe, keep the surrounding community safe, and meet our ecological objectives. Monitoring and adaptive management has increased the effectiveness of those fires. We've seen dramatic fuel reduction and hazard mitigation in our urban interface with broad scale ecological benefits, and we think improved resiliency not just from wildfire. And again, even with all the work we've done, wildfires will still happen here, and they do. But when they do, they're going to be a lot more manageable and a lot easier to manage for us and for the fire suppression folks than had we not been doing this work. But also more resilient in the face of climate change. But ultimately, people are just as important, if not more important, to the long-term viability of our program and our ability to burn in this landscape. Our funding is from the New York State Environmental Protection Fund, which is a dedicated fund through a grant from the New York State DEC.